Alright, everybody. So, today what we're discussing is a different type of academic essay. And you may have come across this one, and even in high school, or you may have come across this and not known exactly that this is what it's called, but this is referred to as a definition essay. And the goal behind this is not really to send you running to a Merriam-Webster's dictionary or dictionary.com and giving a flat-out definition. Generally, this will be in response to something that you have read, watched, or listened to. And essentially what it's doing is it's asking you to take your own experience and to think about it and give your definition of something based on your particular experience. So I put my own definition up here: demonstrate knowledge of a concept or term based on reading, viewing, or experience. So there are many things that you could look towards with this. For example, a simple one that you may have as like a get to know you kind of exercise at the beginning of the semester, or maybe a brainstorming exercise to kind of jumpstart your brain a little bit before you have a discussion as a class or something like that, might be what do you think it means to be happy? Or what do you think it means to be hungry, or to live in poverty? Or what do you think the definition of poverty is? Another one, could be something, define something. I'm trying to think of this standardized test I had to take one time where they had a question at the end that was sort of a critical thinking essay question that said something along the lines of, do you think that, evil can exist in this world, or something along those lines, or can good exist without evil, or something along those lines. So it's giving you the opportunity to either use material that you've been exposed to or your own experiences. I had a couple of students last week, I think they were writing a social studies paper that were talking about poverty levels in America. And both of them had included really great examples of their own personal experiences, viewing other people living, in impoverished circumstances or something like that. Whether it's, I think one of the examples was people standing outside of a church, waiting for the kitchen to be open so that they could get a hot meal. Or another one was driving past an encampment of people that were experiencing homelessness or something like that. So it doesn't have to be always something academic. Your teacher, instructor, professor might ask you to draw upon your own experiences. So before we get to some of the examples, I just put up here, this follows the traditional 5-paragraph structure, a couple of sentences followed by a strong thesis statement, both in your introduction and in your conclusion, what I've called here your final assessment. Your 3 body paragraphs here should contain your support for what you feel is a good definition of whatever they're asking about. So for example, if we were talking about perhaps the definition of it'd be a good one. I'm trying to think of something interesting. Oh, okay. So like I'm sure all of you down here have had some level of experience with classic, traditional Cajun, Creole, Southern kind of cooking. So if you do, then you'll know that, how, for us, my wife and I, growing up in North Carolina, it was nobody barbecues exactly the same way, whether it's the cut of meat or the type of protein that it is or the sauce that they season it with or the dry rub. Everybody does something a little bit different. Same thing here, whether it's gumbo or whether it's king cake or whether it's etouffee or whether it's po' boys or tamales or whatever. Everybody has something that makes them a little bit distinct. So if somebody was to come up to you and ask you to give a definition of authentic Cajun or Creole cooking, how would you define that? I mean, most of us would base it around our own experiences. Like, nobody made it the way that my grandmother did because she did this and this. Or if you're talking about some of the restaurants around here, just down the street from SOLACC, we have Habana Grill, which is pretty authentic Cuban food. I mean, speaking as someone who's been to Florida many, many times and has a deep and strong desire to go to Cuba, I've come pretty close to, or as close as one can get without going to Cuba, of eating food made by, Cuban Americans. So for me, it's really close and very authentic, but it's not the most authentic I've ever had. So if someone was to ask you, like, what is authentic Cajun cooking or what is authentic Creole cooking, I'm sure your definition would be pretty different based on your experiences than, say, the person sitting in the next room or the person sitting next to you in class or the person, driving alongside of you down the road that isn't from down here. It's everybody's is going to be different. So based on that, I've put a couple of examples here of things that, sort of give you the flavor of what it is that you can expect to see in some of these prompts to let you pick up on whether it is a definition type essay or not. So the first one I have here, and some of you I'm sure are young enough to have not been around for any of this, but it was kind of a big deal when it happened. So based on a reading or viewing, because there is a documentary, of An Inconvenient Truth. That was a presentation and book that was later turned into a documentary by former Vice President Al Gore in the early 2000s. So it's primarily based around getting people to pay attention to climate change. And obviously we're dealing with, a lot of things going on in that realm right now, but he was trying to bring people's attention to it about 20 years ago. So based on you reading this particular book, define climate change. So what you would do is you would think back to when you were reading the book, think about some of the points that stuck with you more than anything else, and then you would essentially say, based on my reading or a reading of An Inconvenient Truth, or a viewing if you watch the movie, climate change is best represented as blank, whatever you would want to describe it as. Something that is, if you're on one side, something that's going to destroy our planet and kill off all of our species and everything like that. Or if you're way on the other side of things, maybe it's all just a myth and the planet goes through periods of warming and cooling and scientists don't know what they're talking about. Whatever, not placing any judgments. But so that would kind of be your thesis statement, is literally giving your definition, of climate change. Climate change defined as, after reading An Inconvenient Truth, is represented by blah, whatever you think that it is. Then, in your body paragraphs, you would want to point to specific areas in the book, or in the presentation, or in the documentary, whichever you looked at, and say, he says this, he says this, he says this, and then explain what you took away from those key points that he made. And then finally, in your conclusion or your final assessment, you again want to reword, but essentially repeat your thesis statement, giving a definition for climate change. All right, the second example I have here is, after reading assigned articles, please define responsible gun ownership. So again, I'm purposefully choosing these hot button topics because generally it engages something, in the people who are looking at this. But so assume that you would have read something about school shootings, something about America's fascination with gun culture, something about, maybe from the National Rifle Association about, guns don't kill people, people kill people, blah, 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 whatever. So after looking at those things, what is your definition of responsible gun ownership? Is it responsible gun ownership means each family having one firearm that they keep unloaded and unlocked separate from the ammunition, or unloaded and locked separate from the ammunition in a gun safe? Is it that you keep it on your person at all times? Is it everybody in America, as long as you're not a felon, has the right to bear arms according to the Constitution? Or is it the only safe gun is no gun? Without going down a sort of abstinence pathway, kind of that same argument. Is it an all or nothing thing? So how would you define that based on what you've grown up in? I mean, most of you have grown up with far more deadly and far more violent school shootings than I ever did. I mean, yes, we did have them, but not really on this level outside of Columbine. I'll cop to Columbine. That was horrific. All of them are. But, you didn't see these things like Stoneman Douglas and the one, the elementary school kids, I cannot remember. Anyway, so, what is your experience? Because that's going to play into it a lot. And, what are the readings telling you? Well, more than likely, if you're reading a selection, it's going to tell you that most Americans feel very disproportionately in favor or against, gun control in various forms and everything. It's sort of another one of those issues that doesn't really have a huge common ground. So again, you would make sure you have a thesis statement in the intro and the conclusion, and make sure that you would take your support from the articles that you had been assigned to read. All right, so, pardon me. In this last one, and this is a little bit more philosophical, but thinking about the last few election cycles, if you've paid attention, going back to, 2012, 2016, 2020, the midterm elections a few months ago, things like that. Based on your observations, maybe you hate politics, don't vote, don't care, think that the government, is just going to do what it's going to do regardless. And I can't say that I think you're 100% wrong there. But at the end of the day, after your experience, things you've read, things you've seen, things you've heard other people say, maybe beliefs that your family or your friends have, what would you say is the definition of democracy in America? Are we a democracy? I mean, obviously we're not a monarchy like England. I mean, we don't have a king, although I'm sure that disappoints some people on both sides of the aisle, so to speak. But what is democracy in America? Are we a democracy? Does everybody get an equal vote the way that hypothetically it was supposed to work, although it's never in practice actually worked that way. But what is it, that defines democracy in America? Is it our representatives? Is it our votes for state leaders, country leaders, things like that? Is it that the whole process is rigged? Is it that the whole process doesn't matter? Is it that, it's important what you believe and finding, politicians that share those same values? Or do you stick with a particular party because you or your family has always stuck with that political party? So, in a broad sense, what do we think of the current state of democracy in America? Obviously, that one would probably be better defined, or it would probably be honed in to a specific kind of viewing or reading or something like that. Like, I could, for example, I wouldn't do this to my students, but, I could envision showing 10 to 15 minutes of the highlights or lowlights, depending on your point of view, of the January 6th, 2021, Capitol riot. If I showed you 10 or 15 minutes of that and then asked you, what is your definition of democracy in America right now, my guess is that, we'd have some very different kind of answers depending person to person and things like that. So just be aware of this general concept that sometimes you'll be asked to define things either based on a reading, a viewing, your own experiences, and that they're not so much looking for a textbook, dictionary.com, Merriam-Webster kind of definition. They're looking for your takeaway and how you would incorporate that into your own way of defining a certain term. So it's not necessarily about the powers that be defining it. It's what do you personally take away? What's your personal definition in all of this? All right. I will see you for the next video, and thanks for tuning in.